Hello viewers, welcome to the Bachelor course of Population Studies. In the last lecture, we discussed housing and the problem of homelessness in India. Today, we will discuss about the employment structure in India. India is predominantly an agrarian economy. Even after 6 decades of planned development with a focus on industrialization of the economy, a large chunk of Indian population still earns its living from the primary sector. The theories of structural change indicate the shift of the workforce from the subsistence sector to the modern sector along with the process of growth. This also indicates the shift of the workforce from low productive areas to more productive ones where their productive capacities are optimally utilized. Since the potential of the primary sector of the economy is exhausted at very early stage, therefore, it is essential for rapid growth that the economy must shift from the primary sector to the secondary and tertiary sector. Hence, the evidences from the growth process of developed economies have indicated that during this process, the share of primary sector falls in aggregate employment as well as output. Thus, for rapid progress of the economy, fall in relative importance of the primary sector in employment and output is considered to be desirable. However, the growth experience of India is a strange deviations from these expected outcomes. In India, as the economy moved on the planned growth process, the share of the secondary and tertiary sector in employment and output has been increasing, while that of the primary sector is declining. But the decline in share of primary sector in total employment of the country is much slower than the decline in share in gross domestic product. The primary sector of India still employs about 49% of total workers and contributes merely 14% in the GDP. Thus, about half of the Indian workforce is producing merely 14% of total output, and rest of the half employed in secondary and tertiary sector produces about 86% of the same. Between the secondary and the tertiary sector, again the relative importance of the latter is higher in terms of share in output. This indicates that the structural change in the Indian economy has been characterized by a significant fall in share of primary sector in gross output, but not in total employment. Further, the fall in share of primary sector in total output is due to its slower rise in productivity vis-a-vis other sectors of the economy. Hence, about half of Indian workforce is employed in low productive areas. The dominance of primary sector also determines other characteristics of employment in the country, such as nature, status and character of employment. Hence, in this lecture, we shall discuss about all such aspects of employment in India. First of all, let us discuss about the composition of Indian labour force by gender and location. Indian labour market is characterized by dominance of rural workers and low participation rate by the females. In figure 1, first of all, let us see the rural urban distribution of Indian labour force in 2011-12. The figure shows that out of the total labour force in India, 73.1% belong to the rural areas. The male-female distribution further states that more of the female workers have their location in the rural setting as compared to their male counterparts. Out of total male labour force, about 70% reside in rural areas and the remaining 30% in urban areas, while for the females this ratio is that of 80 and 20. This figure also indicates that more of the females in rural areas participate in labour market as compared to their urban counterparts. Further, looking at the figure 2, we can observe that gender composition of Indian labor force. The figure highlights that out of total labor force, 72% of the males and 28% are females. The proportion of the female is higher in rural areas as compared to the urban ones. In rural areas, out of total labor force, 30% are the females and 70% are males, while in urban areas, 80% are the males and 20% are females. However, the real picture comes to the fore if we look at the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate for the male and for those in rural locations has remained historically higher than the females and urban population. This can be observed from table 1. We can see from this table that the female labor force participation rate has declined from 30% in 1983 to merely 22.5% in 2011-12, while the male labor force participation rate has remained almost stable at 55 to 56% during this period. It is obvious that the decline in overall labor force participation rate in the country is mainly due to decline in the labor force participation rate by females. The female labor force participation rate in the urban areas is much lower than that of the rural areas. Yet, the urban female participation in the labor market has varied between a narrow range of 16% and 18% and reached at its lowest at 15.5% in 2011-12. But in rural areas, it has declined from about 34% in 1983 to about 25% in 2011-12. The rural-urban breakup of the labor force participation rate shows that it is higher in rural areas than the urban ones. But it can be further seen that for males, the labor force participation rate in urban areas has been higher than their rural counterparts, especially since 2004-05. However, during this period, the fall in labor force participation rate for urban males is a bit higher than that of rural males. Now, let us discuss about the structure of employment in India by sectors and nature of employment. Any assessment of employment performance of the Indian economy is not meaningful without an analysis of the structural dimensions of employment. These dimensions not only show the distribution of population across sectors, but also indicate the quality of employment. We know that majority of the Indian workers are employed in agriculture and allied activities. Although the share of primary sector is expected to decline with economic development, but in case of India, the shift of workers from agriculture to non-agriculture sector is much slower than similar shifts in output. The changes in sectoral distribution of Indian workers according to their location and sex between 2 points of time, that is between 1983 and 2011-12, have been shown in this table on your screen. The table shows between 1983 and 2011-12, the share of agriculture in total employment of India fell by almost 20 percentage points, which is nearly similar for both the males and the females. The workers released by agricultural sector are mainly absorbed by the construction sector, which has shown the largest increase in its percentage share out of total employment in the country between these 2 points of time. The share of the construction sector has increased by almost 8 percentage points as compared to merely 2 percentage points for manufacturing and 4 percentage points for other services. Further, the table also gives an account of these shifts across the sectors in rural and urban areas and among the males and females. We can see that as compared to 1983, the share of manufacturing in total employment has declined in urban areas, while it has increased in rural areas. Although both the males and females have shown the increase in their share in employment in this sector, but the increase in females' share is much higher than that of the males. It is due to the fact that women are mainly involved in home based family owned rural enterprises. On the other hand, in the construction sector, the share of the males has increased at a greater rate as compared to the females, while reverse is the case of services. These trends also determine the changes in status of employment in the country. By status of employment, the workers in India are mainly categorized as self-employed workers and hired workers. The self-employed workers are further classified into employers, own account workers and the unpaid family workers, while the hired workers can be categorized as regular workers and casual workers. Since the employment scenario of the country is dominated by agriculture and small scale manufacturing, trading and service enterprises, most of the workers are self-employed or say own account workers, and among the hired workers, a greater proportion of them works in casual jobs. These trends can be observed from figure 3. The figure shows that the proportion of the self-employment in total workers has always remained more than 50%. It has declined from 57.5% in 1983 to 52.2% in 2011-12. On the other hand, rest of the half of the workforce which employed as hired workers, on the other hand, rest of the half of the workforce which is employed as hired workers, about 18% are regular workers and 30% are casual workers. Thus, although the proportion of the regular workers has been increasing continuously since 1983, but still relatively a greater proportion of the hired workers is working as casual workers. We can also observe the gender and rural urban differences in structure of employment status. This can be observed from this figure. The figure shows that relatively a greater proportion of the males and urban workers are employed as regular workers as compared to the females and the rural workers. On the other hand, the proportion of the females and the rural workers is higher in case of self-employed as well as casual workers. In rural areas, about 35% of the workers are employed as casual workers, while this proportion is merely 15% in urban areas. Similarly, out of total workers in urban areas, about 43% are regular workers as compared to less than 9% in rural areas. Thus, regular employment is more a character of the urban areas, while the casual employment is that of the rural areas. Now, we can discuss the quality of employment in India. The sectoral distribution and status of employment largely determine the quality of employment. In a country where agricultural and small manufacturing dominates the employment scenario, majority of the workers are employed in informal sector. The informal sector is generally characterized by employment insecurities, low income and little or no social security. If more of the jobs are being created in the informal sector with all such characteristics, an increase in employment may not necessarily be associated with decline in poverty and inequality. Hence, it is important to observe the qualitative changes in structure of employment in India. We can see the distribution of total workers in India by sector of activity and type of worker in this table. The table shows that out of total workers during 2011-12, 83% were working in the unorganized sector, while 17% were employed in the organized sector. Here, it must be kept in mind that the informal workers refer to all those workers who are without any social security. They may be working in the unorganized as well as organized sector. Hence, we can find that out of total workers in 2011-12, about 92% were the informal workers. This proportion has declined from about 93% in 99-2000 and 2004-05. Interestingly, between 2004-05 and 2011-12, out of total formal workers, the proportion of those employed in the organized sector has increased from 93.3% to 94.8%, showing that now the unorganized sector has fewer number of formal workers. Similarly, within the organized sector, the proportion of the informal workers has also increased from 6.1% to 10.6% during the same period. Thus, we have observed that a big majority of the workers in India are informal workers, mainly working in the unorganized sector. The unorganized sector of India is low productive, and since it is able to evade nearly most of the labor laws and other stipulated conditions, hence the payment to the workers in this sector is much lower as compared to the organized sector. The trends in real wages can be observed from figure 5. The figure clearly indicates the difference in rural urban wages for the regular as well as the casual workers. Though it seems that the wages for the casual workers have increased at a greater rate than that of the regular workers, yet they are much below than the latter. The wages for the casual workers have increased from rupees 58 in 1983 to rupees 143 in 2011-12, while the wages for the regular workers have increased from rupees 169 to rupees 392. The rural urban differences are more remarkable in case of regular workers than the casual workers, not only in absolute terms as shown in the figure, but also in percentage terms. Little calculations can tell us that the casual workers in rural areas are earning about 80% of the wages earned by their rural counterparts, while for regular workers, those with rural locations earn about 67% of the wages earned by their urban workers. Thus, the rural urban differences in wages are also influenced by the status of employment. There are narrower gaps for low quality employment and the wider ones for high quality employment. Well, we can easily understand that here by low quality employment, we refer to casual employment and we consider the regular employment on a positive side. There are many more differences in the quality of regular and casual workers, which may not be exhibited here through figures or data, but by common understanding. For example, the work is not available for all the days in a year to the casual workers, while to the regular workers the payments are also made for the non-working days or the holidays as well as the leave days. Hence, wages may not be the true indicator of the economic conditions of the workers. For this purpose, we generally look at the monthly per capita expenditure of the households. Since majority of the Indian workers work in the unorganized sector, hence a big majority of them earn even below the stipulated minimum wages. Thus, many of the workers work and live under poor conditions. The employment in the country is not a sure path out of poverty. We have a big number of working poor along with the vulnerable who just live hand to mouth with their current level of earnings. In a recent report by Institute of Human Development, New Delhi, it has been highlighted that except the regular workers, more than 50% of the workers belonging to other categories live below $2 a day poverty line. Many of the workers, especially casual workers, are also living below the current official poverty line, which is equivalent to international poverty line of $1 per day. This can be observed from this table on your screen. The table shows that the poverty among the workers of every category in rural as well as urban areas has been declining since 93-94, but still it is substantially higher for the casual workers. In rural areas during 2011-12, about 32% of the casual workers in agriculture and 28% in non-agricultural activities were living below the national poverty line. On the other hand, in urban areas, this proportion is 33%. The things get worse if we extend the poverty line to $2 a day in purchasing power parity terms. We can see from this table that about 76% of the casual workers in non-agricultural activities and 82% in agricultural activities in rural areas and 58% of the casual workers in urban areas live below the international poverty line of $2 a day. The poverty ratios for the self-employed are about 62% in agriculture and 66% in non-agricultural activities in rural areas and about 32% in urban areas. The lowest poverty ratio can be found in case of regular workers, both in case of national as well as international poverty line of $2 a day. Let us come to the conclusion of this lecture. To sum up, we can say that during the last 2 decades, when Indian economy underwent faster economic growth, employment opportunities have increased for both the males and females in rural as well as urban areas. However, the structure of employment has shown slower improvement as compared to the production structure of the economy. The labor force released by the agriculture sector has not been adequately absorbed by the non-agriculture sectors. Hence, majority of the workforce is found to be working in agriculture sector and small manufacturing. Both of these sectors are mainly unorganized in character. Therefore, a big majority of the workforce in India is employed as informal workers. This indicates that the quality of employment is not very decent one. Though the proportion of the self-employed workers out of total workers has been declining in India, but it is adding more to the casual jobs than to the regular jobs. Thus, informalization of the workforce in India is also associated with casualization of the workforce. We have also observed that being employed is not a sure shot way to overcome poverty, as we can easily see poverty among the employed persons. The poverty ratio among the casual workers is much higher than the self-employed and regular workers, while the regular workers have lowest poverty ratio among all categories of the workers. This suggests that insecure and irregular jobs do not help the workers to come out of the morass of poverty. Further, the unorganized sector is also responsible for low level of wages which are even lower than the minimum necessary to meet the basic needs. Hence, there is a need of direct government intervention to strictly implement the Minimum Wage Act in the unorganized sector of the economy. We agree that it is an uphill task in a vast economy dominated by small scale family enterprises. But this is not an impossible task, and the administrative or fiscal difficulties of the central controlling agency are not greater than the miseries of millions of the masses. This needs to be done with utmost urgency if we are really serious about inclusive growth in words as well as the spirits. That is all with today's lecture. I hope this must have added to your knowledge. Next time we will discuss about population and poverty. Till then, have a nice time. Bye bye.